What if Volodymyr Zelensky isn't just a president asking for help? What if he's a master strategist who's cleverly backed the world's most powerful nations into a corner they can't easily escape? While the main story we hear is of Ukraine totally dependent on Western goodwill, the reality is far more complex and, frankly, more brilliant. For years, we've watched this brutal conflict unfold, and one question has dominated everything. Will Western support for Ukraine last? But looking at it that way, a passive Ukraine waiting for handouts, misses the entire point. It's easy to see it as a simple equation. Ukraine needs weapons and money, and the West provides them. But that's like describing a chess match as just moving pieces on a board. It ignores the strategy, the foresight, the gambits. The true genius of the Ukrainian leader approach is that he reframed the entire conflict. He knew from day one that this wasn't just a war for territory, it was a war of narratives, and he weaponized the West's own identity against itself, forcing nations to look in the mirror and ask, do we actually believe in the democratic values we preach? Are sovereignty and international law just talking points, or are they worth defending? This is the story of how Zelensky, through a masterful blend of moral pressure and shrewd diplomacy, transformed Ukraine's fight for survival into the West's ultimate test of credibility. And he isn't just holding a key. In many ways, he helped design the lock. Welcome to Empire Secrets. To really get the genius of this strategy, you have to understand the enormous challenge it was designed to overcome, the ever-present threat of ally fatigue. From the moment the full-scale invasion began, the clock started ticking. History is littered with examples of international coalitions that start strong only to fracture as the costs pile up and the conflict carries on. The initial shock of the invasion galvanized the world, but shock and horror are fleeting. They are not a sustainable foundation for a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar commitment. Zelensky and his team knew this. They knew that when war ground on, headlines about heroic resistance would be replaced by stories of inflation, energy prices, and domestic political fights. This isn't cynical, it's realistic. Western leaders have to answer to their own people. They face elections. They have to justify spending billions on a foreign war when their citizens are struggling. We saw this play out in real time. Political divisions, especially in the US, became a major storyline, with aid packages turning into fiercely partisan battles. In Europe, countries started worrying about their own depleted military stockpiles. How much could they give out without leaving themselves vulnerable? And that it shows up in public opinion polls that reveal a gradual decline in support for the war. While early support was sky high, by late 2025 and into 2026, surveys in several European countries showed a noticeable dip in the public's appetite to back Ukraine indefinitely. Those aren't just numbers, they are powerful political signals that leaders can't ignore. The fatigue also came from fear. The one word that echoed in every discussion about sending more advanced weapons was escalation. Western leaders were, and still are, terrified of provoking a direct conflict with a nuclear-armed Russia. This fear acted as a constant brake. Ukraine would ask for tanks, and it would trigger months of debate. They'd ask for long-range missiles, and the same agonizing process would repeat. This hesitancy was a clear symptom of a deeper anxiety holding the West back from a full commitment. The situation was dire. Ukraine was caught in a vicious cycle. To win, it needed better weapons. But to get those weapons, it had to maintain the unwavering support of allies who were growing tired, divided, and fearful. The natural momentum was toward a slow decline in aid, a drift toward a weak negotiating settlement, or a frozen conflict that would leave Ukraine permanently crippled. That was the abyss Ukraine was staring into. It was a problem that couldn't be solved on the battlefield. So, faced with the paralysis of ally fatigue, Zelensky understood it required a different kind of strategy. The Ukrainian president launched a campaign designed to agitate the conscience of the West, to raise the stakes so high that backing down would seem more dangerous than moving forward. If the problem was a waning attention span, the solution was to make the world see this wasn't just Ukraine's problem, it was their problem. Zelensky's core message resonated simple but profound. This isn't a regional border dispute, it's the front line in a global struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. In speech after speech, he hammered this point home. His communication style was a key weapon. The former actor knew how to command a stage. Appearing via video link in his iconic olive green, he tailored his message to each audience. To the British Parliament, he invoked Churchill. To the US Congress, he referenced Pearl Harbor and 9/11. He was positioning Ukraine as the modern-day inheritor of their own finest hours, making it their historic duty to stand with him. Crucially, he spoke over the heads of governments, directly to their people. This built a groundswell of popular support that made it politically costly for leaders to waver. He understood that in a democracy, public opinion is currency, and he worked tirelessly to bank as much of it as possible. He also consistently warned that a Russian victory wouldn't be the end, but the beginning of a more dangerous era, transforming the war into a direct threat to global stability. But perhaps the most potent part of this strategy was the accountability trap. Zelensky wasn't afraid to publicly criticize his allies for their hesitancy. When aid was slow, he said so. In one pointed interview, he addressed the West's obsession with escalation, saying something to the effect of how the world seems used to Ukrainians dying. And for many, that's not seen as an escalation. It was a raw, uncomfortable, and devastatingly effective line. He could be withering in his critiques, chiding leaders for the gaps between their powerful rhetoric and their often timid actions. At forums like the World Economic Forum in early 2026, he delivered sharp rebukes, stating that Europe at times looks lost and acts more like a geography than a true political force. Surely a high-risk strategy that risked alienating partners. But it also created immense public pressure, framing aid not as a gift, but as the fulfillment of a duty. By defining the narrative in these stark, moral terms, he agitated the conscience of the West and made the cost of looking away intolerably high. But words and moral pressure aren't enough to sustain a war. Their ephemeral and political winds shift. The next phase of his strategy was to translate that moral obligation into something tangible, durable, and politically binding. This led to one of the most brilliant and underappreciated elements of his strategy, weaving a web of bilateral security agreements. And it wasn't just about the next missile shipment. It was about building a new security architecture for Ukraine, piece by piece, starting after the G7's joint declaration of support in July 2023. Ukraine began methodically negotiating and signing long-term security pacts with its key partners. By late 2025, it had signed nearly 30 such agreements with nations including the UK, Germany, France, Canada, the US, and Japan. These agreements were a diplomatic masterstroke. They outlined commitments for 10 years of military support, intelligence sharing, and defense industry cooperation. But their true genius lies in what they represent. While not legally binding Article 5 mutual defense treaties, they create powerful political and moral obligations that function as a sort of NATO by proxy. They essentially lock in the most powerful members of the alliance to the long-term security of Ukraine. Instead of needing every member to agree on every step, Zelensky secured individual commitments, building a coalition of the willing that became too powerful to ignore. These formal documents make it significantly harder for a future government in any of these countries to abruptly cut off support without being seen as breaking a formal promise. And it connects directly to the push for NATO membership. While the alliance stopped short of a formal invitation, stating it could be extended when allies agree and conditions are met, the bilateral pacts became part of the answer, showing that Ukraine was already integrating with NATO standards on the ground. Zelensky essentially said, "You declared our security is integral to yours. Here is the agreement that formalizes that." Ukraine was no longer just an aid recipient, it was a strategic partner. A quiet, methodical, and brilliant way of ensuring that no matter who is in the White House or 10 Downing Street, the commitment is woven into the very fabric of their foreign policy. In the next phase of the strategy, Zelensky needed a tool to drive short-term action and break through the West's fear of escalation. For that, he needed a concrete proposal that shifted the debate from "how do we avoid losing" to "how do we win?" That proposal became known as the Victory Plan. Unveiled in October 2024, the Victory Plan was a bold, 5-point pathway. Although the first pillar was a massive surge in weapons, the real masterstroke was the second, lifting all restrictions on using Western long-range missiles against military targets deep inside Russia. For years, this was the ultimate red line for partners like the US and Germany. Zelensky's plan frontally attacked this logic. He argued that the restriction was in effect giving Russia a sanctuary from which to launch attacks. By making this a central plank of his plan, he forced an open debate on an issue that was previously discussed only behind closed doors. The third major pillar was a formal invitation for Ukraine to join Nato. Zelensky argued that only NATO's mutual defense clause could prevent Russia from attacking again in the future. The Western response was predictably cautious, but judging the plan on its immediate adoption misses the point entirely. Its true purpose was to shift the Overton window, the range of politically acceptable policies. Most importantly, the plan's maximalist demands made other, previously difficult proposals seem more reasonable. A prime example is the G7 decision to use profits from frozen Russian assets to back a $50 billion loan for Ukraine. In the context of Zelensky's relentless push, that radical step started to look like a clever compromise, a way for the West to provide a huge injection of funds without dipping further into their strained national budgets. The victory plan wasn't just a plan, it was a strategic lever. Even where it was rejected, it succeeded. It forced uncomfortable conversations, exposed inconsistencies in Western policy, and created political space for breakthroughs in other areas. It was a classic negotiation tactic. Ask for the ideal to get the possible. So, what happens when the West says no? A leader solely dependent on aid would have to wait. But this is where Zelensky revealed another layer of his framework, the asymmetric pivot to domestic production and direct action. When the West hesitated on long-range strike capabilities, Ukraine decided to build its own. Over the course of the war, Ukraine has dramatically scaled up its domestic defense industry, focusing on one game-changing technology: long-range attack drones. These are sophisticated drones, some capable of striking targets over 1,000 kilometers away. President Zelensky has called for producing tens of thousands in 2025 alone. The genius here is threefold. First, it was a military workaround. While allies debated, Ukrainian-made drones began hitting oil refineries, airfields, and industrial sites deep inside Russia, imposing direct costs the West was afraid to. Second, it reshaped the narrative of dependency. By showcasing its own innovation, Ukraine projected an image of self-reliance. It's easier to justify supporting a country that's actively helping itself. The message was clear. We're not just waiting for handouts, we are building the tools to win. Your support will amplify our efforts, not just substitute for them. Third, and most importantly, it created new diplomatic leverage. The successful drone strikes put the West in an awkward position. Ukraine was now achieving the very military objectives that Western restrictions were meant to prevent. This forced a new calculation on Allied leaders. Did it still make sense to withhold their more powerful missiles when Ukraine was already proving its willingness and ability to conduct such strikes on its own? The domestic drone program became an implicit threat and a powerful argument. It told allies, we're going to do this one way or another. We could do it with our developing systems, or more effectively with your proven technologies. The strategic objective will be met regardless. It was a demonstration of resolve that forced partners to constantly re-evaluate whether their cautious policies were becoming obsolete in the face of Ukrainian innovation. But no strategy operates in a vacuum. Zelensky's diplomatic offensive was waged on a battlefield fraught with invisible tripwires. Political divisions in the West, Russia's relentless disinformation, and the grinding human cost of a long war. Russia has actively worked to exploit every crack in the Western coalition, amplifying narratives of war fatigue and fueling political movements calling for less support for Ukraine. Zelensky's sharp criticism of allies, while effective, also carried risks. Some partners, like Hungary, used his rhetoric to portray Ukraine as ungrateful and block aid packages. There was a constant balancing act between applying pressure and alienating the partners upon whom Ukraine's survival depended. Furthermore, the internal debates in Western nations reflected genuine anxieties about a direct confrontation with Russia and depleted military stockpiles. Zelensky's strategy couldn't just dismiss these concerns, it had to reframe them. He had to convince his partners that the risk of a Ukrainian collapse was far greater than the risk of escalation. This is where the final crucial element of his leverage comes in: the unwavering resolve of the Ukrainian people. Throughout the conflict, Poles have consistently shown overwhelming domestic support for the war and a staunch refusal to accept territorial concessions. Even as the war has taken a horrific toll, a vast majority of Ukrainians have continued to believe in victory. This incredible public resilience gave Zelensky his most powerful mandate. When Western partners floated the ideas of land for peace, he could credibly respond that it wasn't his decision to make. He could point to the will of his people and state, truthfully, that any leader who tried to cede territory would be rejected. The democratic will of the Ukrainian people became a strategic asset, a bulwark against pressure to compromise. He masterfully wove this into his international messaging. He's not just a president fighting a war, he's the representative of a nation, unified in its determination to be free. This allows him to speak with a moral authority that few other world leaders can match. So, what have we seen? It's a complex, multi-layered and brilliantly executed campaign that's far more than a simple plea for help. Volodymyr Zelensky took a position of perceived weakness and transformed it into one of extraordinary influence. He has engineered a situation where supporting Ukraine is no longer just charity, but a strategic and moral imperative. Is it a risky gamble? Absolutely. But in the face of an existential threat, caution isn't always a virtue. The genius of this strategy lies in its audacity. It recognized that in a struggle against a larger foe, playing by the conventional rules is a losing game. So, he rewrote the rules. He changed the game from one military might to one of political will. And in that arena, he has proven to be a grandmaster. The question for the West is no longer if they should support Ukraine, but for how long they can afford not to. If you found this analysis insightful, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into strategy and geopolitics. Now I want to hear from you. Do you see this as a stroke of diplomatic genius or a high-stakes gamble that could have backfired? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. This was Empire Secrets. Your desire, your empire.